Hepiniz yayınımıza hoş geldiniz. İlo Türkiye Ofisi adına hepinizi saygıyla, sevgiyle selamlıyorum. Bugün yeni bir etkinlikle karşınızdayız. COVID-19 salgınının istihdam üzerine etkilerini bugün sizlerle konuşuyor olacağız. Biliyorsunuz aslında salgının en başından beri çok merak ettiğimiz bir konu bu. Salgının istihdam üzerine, işgücü piyasası üzerine etkileri neler oldu? Maalesef bizim bugüne kadar kullandığımız aslında geleneksel klasik yöntemler salgının istihdam üzerine etkilerini ölçmekte bu süreçte yetersiz kaldı. Bunun pek çok sebebi var ama önemli sebeplerinden bir tanesi aslında bu dönemde istihdamı koruyucu alınan önlemlerdi. Biliyorsunuz kısa çalışma ödeneği, ücretsiz izin, işten çıkartma yasakları gibi önlemler bir yandan istihdamı korurken bir yandan da bizim iş gücü piyasası üzerinde etkileri ölçmemizi zorlaştırdı. Biz hepimiz bu dönemde işsizlik oranının, işsiz sayısının artacağını beklerken resmi rakamlara göre bunlara düşüş oldu. Hepimiz tabii ki çok şaşırdık. Dediğim gibi bunun pek çok sebepleri var. Biz İLO olarak bu salgının başından beri küresel olarak iş gücü piyasaları üzerine etkilerini ölçmeye çalıştık. Bu ölçümden yaşanan sıkıntılardan dolayı da aslında yeni bir yöntem geliştirdi İLO. Eş değer iş kaybı üzerinden bunları biz vermeye çalıştık. Yani haftalık çalışma saatleri üzerinden ne kadar iş gücü kaybı yaşandı bunu ölçmeye çalıştık. Bunlar tabii düzenli yayınlanan raporlar ama Türkiye özelinde değil. Küreselde bütün dünyadaki etkileri gösteriyor. Biz tabii Türkiye'deki durumu merak etmeye devam ettik. Disk Konfederasyonu gibi konfederasyonlar, çeşitli üniversiteler İLO yöntemini kullanarak aslında bunları hesaplamaya çalıştılar. Bunlar da çok faydalı oldu salgının istihdam üzerindeki etkilerini anlamak üzerine. Ama hala benim aklımda bir soru vardı. Pek çoğunuzun da aklında vardır eminim. Burada tabii ki bakılan şey bir önceki aya göre veya bir önceki yılın aynı ayına göre istihdamdaki değişmeleri aslında hep ölçen yöntemlerdi bunlar. Ama bunların da bir kısıtı var. Çünkü Covid olmasaydı aslında ne olurdu? Bu sorunun cevabını vermiyorlardı. Çünkü bir şeyin etkisini ölçebilmek için aslında o olmasa ne olurdu, olunca ne olurdu? Buna bakmamız gerekiyor. Dolayısıyla tabii ki bunu tam olarak bilemeyiz. Covid olmasa ne olurdu? Bunu hiç kimse bilemez. Ama bunu tahmin etmenin bazı yöntemleri var. Bazı ekonometrik modeller kullanarak bir takım varsayımlar üzerine bunları inşa etmek mümkün. Dolayısıyla biz de burada bunu yapmaya çalıştık. Benim daha önce Türkiye'de rast gelmediğim bir çalışma oldu. Bu çalışmayı da İLO Türkiye ofisinden çok değerli araştırma uzmanımız Luis Pinedo yaptı. Luis daha önce İLO Genel Merkezi'nde istihdam biriminde çalışıyordu ve İLO'nun pek çok küresel raporunun altında imzası vardı. Bu çalışmayı ofisimiz adına bizde çalışan Luis yapmış oldu. Bu çalışmada biz COVID'in istihdam üzerine etkilerine baktık. Pek çok alt kategoride bunları birazdan sizlere sunacağız. Örneğin yaş ve cinsiyet bağlamında etkisi ne oldu? Kayıtlı çalışanlar, kayıt dışı çalışanlar arasında bunlar arasında bir fark oluştu mu? Bunlar nasıl etkilendi? Yine istihdam edilme durumuna göre ücretli çalışanlar, işverenler, kendi hesabında çalışanlar onlar nasıl etkilendi? Onlara baktık. Yine ekonomik sektörler bakımından tarım, sanayi, inşaat gibi pek çok alt sektörde bunları inceledik. Eğitim durumuna göre baktık. Dolayısıyla tüm bu alt kategorilerde en çok etkilenen kişiler, gruplar üzerinden bunu biraz anlamaya çalıştık. Şimdi Luis bize çalışmasını sunacak. Yaklaşık 1 saatlik en fazla bir sunum olacak. Ondan sonraki yarım saatlik bölümde de soru cevap bölümümüz olacak. Orada da sizlerin sorularını birlikte yanıtlamaya çalışacağız. Ben daha fazla uzatmadan sözü Luis'e vermek istiyorum. Programı İngilizce takip etmek isteyenler için de altta interpretation butonu var. Oraya basarak da yine dili seçme imkanınız var. Luis, söz sende.
Thank you very much, Mambe. Thank you very much for everyone who is attending the event today. Let's start with the presentation. As our director rightly pointed out today, I will be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on employment in Turkey with the data that we have been able to gather so far from Turkestat. As you all know, the pandemic has hit the whole world. It has affected the world of work. There has been restrictions to mobility, there has been lockdowns, there has been social distance, it's harder to do business. And the question we have is how it affected Turkey's employment levels. And this is what we will try to find out today. Now, the reason why we are doing this is not just to know the overall impact on over employment in Turkey. The reason why we do this is to understand, because we want to know who was hit hardest by the pandemic, who suffered the most by this pandemic, so that we can focus our efforts on helping the workers that need it the most. As Numambe pointed out, there are many ways to assess the impact of the pandemic, but no matter how we assess it, we are creating what is called a counterfactual scenario. Counterfactual is a hypothetical world. It doesn't exist. It is how it would have been the economy, the labor market, if COVID-19 hadn't come early this year. Or more precisely, how would employment levels have changed if COVID-19 hadn't arrived in January 2020? Now, there are different ways of doing so. What you have, I am presenting now, is the real data on overall employment in Turkey. On the left axis, on the vertical axis, we can see employment in thousands. So we can see it was fluctuating around 27, 28 million over 2019. And then when the crisis started around January, February, employment levels started to decrease. There are several ways to build counterfactuals. One way to do it is by assuming employment levels would have behaved as they behaved last year. That's the red line that says last year. And then we can compare the difference. Another way is to assume that employment levels would continue as they were in January when the crisis started. And that one is shown as the green line. Now, this is something that can be done, and these strategies may sometimes provide reasonable results and a reasonable approximation. However, in the current economic context, they are likely to underestimate the impact of the pandemic. And that's why we are here today, and that's why we are doing what we are doing today. There are signals, for instance, last quarter of 2019, economic growth of GDP was 6.5% in Turkey. Over the first quarter of 2020, economic growth was still positive, even though the pandemic had already started at 4.4. That is, there were signals of economic recovery after very tough times for the labor market over the last 2 years. On top of that, there was an increase in the number of construction permits in the last quarter of 2019. This is something that we hadn't seen in the last 2 years. There were also tough times for the construction sector. Likewise, there was an increase in the confidence in the construction sector over December, January. As we will see later, this is normally related to an increase in employment after a few months. To summarize, there are signals that Turkey's economy might have fared better than it did in 2019, and therefore comparing our current numbers with 2019 numbers is likely to give us smaller numbers, smaller impact. On top of that, using these naive, simplistic strategies as comparing last year may also provide some unreasonable or awkward results in the sense of us having more jobs with COVID-19 than without COVID-19, which is not acceptable. What we are proposing today is to use a simple econometric model. It is called autoregressive distributed lag model. There are one of the many models that can be used for forecasting and for trying to guess what would have happened without the pandemic. Basically, what we do is to feed past values of employment into this model. We feed past values of other macroeconomic variables until January 2019, which is the moment the pandemic started. So we don't use any information from January 2020 onwards, and the month of the year to cover for seasonality, seasonal patterns. Now, to give an example of what can go wrong when we follow one strategy or the other, this is the number of men in industry in Turkey. This is a time series starting in January 2018. On the vertical axis, you can see employment. Employment in industry was fluctuating between 4 million and 4.4 million. And I added two lines. One, there are two counterfactuals. One uses last year data. It is in green. And we can see a small problem here. The fact that in March, our counterfactual says that employment is actually lower without COVID-19 than it was with COVID-19. This is something that we can fix or repair when we use the econometric model, which is the red line. And we can see that there is no awkward result. It automatically goes above the real data and expects an impact, a negative impact of COVID-19 on employment. And this is something that can happen in other series, and that's one of the reasons why we are using a slightly more sophisticated model. Now, to explain what this model is doing, I will show you what is called an in-sample prediction. The green data, again, this is men in industry. The green line shows real data. It shows the number of men in industry from January 2014 all the way to January 2020. And then the red line is the prediction that this econometric model prepared for this data. That is, let's say we go to September 2018, and we give the model data up to September 2018, and then we ask the model, okay, can you tell us what will happen? What will be happening in November? And so on. And so we did it from 2015 all the way to 2020. And as we can see, the model is able, with the information that we have provided, to follow the data. And therefore, we can credibly ask the model to continue the series after January 2020. Now, the data that we are using for this forecasting exercise is data from Turkestat, from the labor force survey, starting in February 2014 all the way to August 2020 for comparisons. There is data on employment. It is disaggregated by age group, by gender, by status in employment, by economic activity, by educational attainment, by formality of work arrangements, and by occupation. And we will be also having a look at out of employment activities. That is, the number of people who are unemployed, discouraged job seekers. Discouraged job seekers who are people who would like to work, but who are not actively looking for a job. That's the distinction between those who are unemployed, and then we have women who are at home fulfilling domestic duties. We have people who are retired, people who are sick or disabled, and people who are in education. On top of that, we have macroeconomic information fed in the model. We will be having inflation, consumer confidence, retail confidence, industry output, exports, construction costs, construction confidence, number of construction permits, building permits, as well as the exchange rate between the Turkish lira and the US dollar. All this information is fed into the model for the model to be able to forecast what would be happening in 2020 with employment levels. Once again, this information was used up to January 2020. No other information is used after January 2020 because it would be biased. It would have been also affected by the pandemic. So now that the methodology has been briefly explained and we can more or less understand what it is that we are doing and why, let's start with the analysis. The first part is the impact of COVID-19 on employment. We are going to start with the overall impact, just to have an idea of what the model is doing. The overall impact on employment is 7%. That is, we, on average, between February and August, we lost around 7% of the jobs in Turkey. In this graph, you can see the real data in blue. You can see total employment on the vertical axis, and you can have data from January 2018 all the way to August 2020. On top of that, I have added the counterfactual, the hypothetical scenario from the econometric model. It is in red, crimson, and you can see that what the econometric model is predicting is an improvement of employment levels with respect to what would have happened in 2019, although not as high as it was in 2018. In any case, the model is predicting a recovery in terms of employment. Here we can see the evolution of the overall impact of the pandemic on total employment from February all the way to August, and we can see how the impact deepened when we got close to March, especially April. All the restrictions started in Turkey. We were also having problems in May. In June, restrictions started to be lifted. The impact started to be a bit smaller, and little by little we are recovering jobs. As of August, which is the latest data that is available, the impact has been down to minus 4.7%, around almost 5% of the jobs are still or were still missing in August. Now, as I commented in the beginning, we are not just concerned about the overall impact. We want to know who exactly, because an overall 7% can mean 2% for some groups, but it can also mean 20, 30, 40% for some other groups, as we will see now. Let's have a look at gender, at formality, whether they are registered in the Social Security Institute or not, and by age group. Now, here we can start seeing some differences between groups. On the vertical axis of this graph, we see the impact, the percentage change in employment. It goes from 0 to minus 18. And then we have 7 groups. We have the overall impact on the left-hand side. We have already seen it. I put it just for comparison. We have gender. Women have been more affected by the pandemic than men. 8% impact for women, 6% for men. Formality, that is whether they are registered or not. That is one of the keys of this pandemic. Informal workers lost 14% of their jobs compared to only 5% of formal workers. We all know that formal workers have been way more protected for several reasons during this pandemic. I mean, first of all, they had this reduced hour support, which is called in Turkish çalışma desteği. It basically allowed employers not to dismiss workers, and they still would get some money. On top of that, dismissals were banned almost in all cases. And employers were also allowed to give to send workers on unpaid leave. Basically, there were many measures before workers could be dismissed. And then we also have another interesting group, which is young people. I mean, once again, as it happens in every single crisis we have been attesting in the last years, young people are the ones who suffer the most. Young people here are defined as those aged 15 to 24. When we compare their employment performance, they lost 16% of their jobs compared to just 5% for adults aged 25 or over. Now, this is worrisome, but we will see more about this later. In terms of evolution, we can see similar patterns. We can see how employment levels went down for men and for women in April, May, all the way to 10%, 11%, 12%. They started recovering. For formality, the hit was even stronger. Informal workers lost 22% of their jobs at the peak of the pandemic last April. This is something that formal workers never suffer. The impact is much more smoother, and it didn't really change much over the course of the pandemic. Now, something we can also see is that informal jobs are very quick to be recovered, and the impact has decreased quite a bit since April to August, and now stands at around 9% of employment losses. And finally, by age group, and this is, in my opinion, much more worrisome, is the impact on young people and the evolution. Not only young people lost 21% of their jobs at the peak of the pandemic, in this case, the peak for them was May, but as of August, they are still missing 15% of their jobs. This is a problem because the longer young people stay away from the labor market, the lower the chances for them to come back, and the higher the chances for them to remain out of employment. So this is calling for some action. But let's continue. We can also divide the impact by age and gender. Why? Because young women are particularly vulnerable to losing employment. And we can see that the average impact has been even harder for young women. Young women, which are women aged 15 to 24, lost 19% of the jobs, compared to young men who only lost 15%. Something similar happens in terms of evolution. The evolution for young women touched bottom in May. 25%, 1 in every 4 jobs held by young women disappeared in the middle of the pandemic. The impact as of August is almost 20%. Now, I will tell you one thing about this. Once young people become a need is someone who is neither in employment nor in education, their chances for finding a job over the next year for a man is around 75%. So they are relatively high. However, for women, they are much lower. Women who are need only have around 25%, 30% chances of leaving that status. That is, the longer these women remain out of employment, the harder it will be for them to come back, and the lower it will be the employment rate for women in the future. Now, another dimension we can have a look at is by status in employment. Status in employment refers to whether a person is an employee or a salary worker, an employer, meaning someone who has employees, a non-account worker, which is also a self-employed person, but without employees, or an unpaid family worker. On average, the impact doesn't show many differences. It is around 8% for employees on average, counting both formal and informal employees together, minus 12% for employers, around 6.4% for own account workers, and around 11% for unpaid family workers. But there are some changes, differences hidden in this graph. So let's have a look at the evolution. In terms of evolution, we can see that the employees that own account workers, as well as unpaid family workers, have recovered most of the lost jobs over the course of the pandemic. However, something different happens with employers. Employers didn't start recovering businesses until August. It is taking much slow. It is taking much more time for them to come back, and it's understandable. I mean, they put bigger investments. They also face bigger risks, and it will be harder for them to come back. Now, I want to talk about employers, especially I want to talk about formal employers in the non-agricultural sector, because these employers are the ones who provide most formal jobs in Turkey. They are critical for the success, for the provision of decent work in this country. Now, almost 3 in 4 employers are formal employers. What happened to them? Basically, the number of employers in Turkey has been hovering around 1 million since 2014, between 950,000 to 1,050,000. However, since 2018, the number of employers had been decreasing continuously, touching bottom around September 2019, where the country has already lost 200,000 employers. Luckily, the number started to pick up towards the end of 2019. We have already seen there were signals of economic recovery, there were signals of increased confidence. And unfortunately, at that very point, the pandemic came and brought the number of employers down all the way to 800,000, so even further losses. And on the contrary, the econometric model is predicting a counterfactual, a hypothetical scenario where the number continued increasing slightly over 2020. That's why we see an impact. Then we can have a look at economic activities. This one is interesting because not all economic activities are impacted the same. For instance, we have the government, which is offering relatively safe, secure jobs. We have the health sector, where workers were even banned from leaving their jobs, their posts. We have education, where workers have been more or less able to teach online and kind of continue their activities. But then we also have activities that require close contact, that are face-to-face. We have especially hospitality. What happened? What is the average impact between February to August by economic activity? As you could imagine, hospitality means bars, restaurants, hotels. On average, they lost 21% of the jobs. Next, we have other services. Other services are kind of low skill services, like people who are shoe cleaners. We have women who are cleaning households. We have arts. We have cleaners, etc. They appear there, minus 15%. And next, we have the construction sector with an impact of 14% on average over the course of the pandemic. Other than this, there has been other sectors like trade, like transport, that has also been particularly hit, but not as much. And we can see that the impact has been very small in the public administration, minus 2.5%, in education, teaching, minus 2.8%, and in health is minus 5.5%. But it's not because of workers who are in hospitals, it is because of social workers, okay? This sector puts them all together, and they are the ones that explain this fall in employment. Now, I would like to have a look at the construction sector in particular to show you a little bit of how the model works, and also to understand why the impact in the construction sector has been relatively high, or one of the highest. Now, the model is predicting a recovery in the construction sector. The question is whether this is reasonable or not. In this graph, I am showing you two time series. One is the number of construction permits. You can see the number on the right-hand side. It is in millions, and it is in bars. We can see that the number of construction permits was around 50, 60 millions over 2014, 15, 16. It increased in 2017, and then it started going down. It was really, really low in 2019, where the sector was having one of the worst times in the last years. And in the last quarter of 2019, it started to pick up. And something similar happened with the confidence in the construction sector. Here we can see that it touched bottom in the end of 2018. It remained low over 2019, and it started to go up in December, January 2020. So let's compare now the confidence in the construction sector with the number of men in construction, with employment. Employment is on the left-hand side, on the vertical axis of the graph. It is in thousands. So employment in the construction sector is around 1.5 million, 2 million before 2018. And if we go to November or to January, November or December 2014, we can see that in December 2014, the confidence in the construction sector started to increase. 3 months later, employment also started to increase. If we go to January 2016, confidence started to increase. 3 months later, employment started to increase. January 2017, confidence goes up. 2 months later, employment goes up. January 2018, confidence goes up. Employment after 3 months goes up, and so on. Basically, this is what we fed the model with. This is the idea the model gets, and that's why the model predicts an increase in employment in the construction sector, which is what we see here in green in the counterfactual. In fact, if the model hadn't predicted that increase in employment, the actual number of workers in the construction sector in blue would have been higher than the prediction. That is, we would have been predicting less jobs without pandemic. That's why it's important to take into account all the information that exists before the pandemic. In terms of evolution of some of these sectors, here I have shown the evolution of industry, of trade, of hospitality, and other services. This is the impact month by month from February to August. We can see that there has been some recovery, including hospitality, but still, as of August, and August is the big month for tourism sector, for hospitality, 16% of the jobs were still missing. And we will see whether the hospitality sector can recover them in the near future, given that the pandemic is still ongoing. As I said before, formality is crucial in explaining the impact on employment. We wouldn't be able to explain it without knowing whether workers are registered with the Social Security Institute or not. Let's have a look at this. I am showing status in employment by formality. So we will have formal employees, informal employees, formal employers, informal employers, formal on-account workers, informal on-account workers. what we see, formal employees minus 5%, informal minus 22%, formal employers minus 9%, informal minus 20%, formal on-account workers on average almost no impact, informal minus 10.5%, unpaid family workers, which we consider all to be informal due to the nature of their work arrangements, minus 26%. 1 in 4 jobs also went away on average. Now, we know that employees have been protected, but also formal employers have been protected. There was a shield package with measures to help companies in terms of delaying payments of taxes, delaying payments of social security contributions, and so on. And we can see how this may have also helped formal employers to remain in operation. When we have a look at the recovery, we also see differences depending on the status in employment. Informal employees are very quickly recovering their jobs. It doesn't seem very worrisome in terms of people remaining out of work. However, for employers, the impact as of August is still around 10% for both informal and formal employers. And even more worrisome is the evolution for formal employers. The number of formal employers kept decreasing in comparison with the counterfactual up to July. And it was only in August when the impact started to decrease. We will have to follow the evolution. I mean, it is very important for job creation. We will have to keep an eye on them. On-account workers are also recovering slowly jobs. There is nothing remarkable to have to look at here. And finally, unpaid family workers are also recovering extremely fast the jobs that were lost because of the pandemic. In April, May, almost 1 in 2 jobs of unpaid family workers outside of agricultural sector were lost. But it is very easy to dismiss them. I mean, they are part of the family, they work for the family business, and it's also very easy to bring them back. I mean, they are unpaid, there is no contract, there is no hassle. So the same way they went away, they came back. This is not particularly worrisome in terms of employment. When we look at occupations, we see something that is shaped by formality and by, let's say, the economic activity, close contact, and social distance. How? Well, service workers have been the most affected ones. Why? Because service workers are working in hospitality, and also many service workers tend to be informally employed. So it's not surprising. I mean, this is not bringing anything new here. It's just another way of looking at it. Professionals, which are generally considered high-skill occupations, had one of the smallest impacts of the pandemic. Only 4% of the jobs were lost. And something similar can be said about those in elementary occupations, generally low-skilled workers. The impact was also higher. They also tend to be employed informally. Educational attainment, same story. The more you have been in school, the lower your chances of being affected by the pandemic. And it is pretty regular. Those without formal education, 16% impact. Without high school, 11% impact. Those with high school, with lycée, they have around 7%. Vocational high school, minus 6%. And those with university degrees, only 3% impact, minus 2.7%. So, to summarize, informality is crucial to explain the impact on employment in Turkey. As such, groups that have a higher tendency or a higher propensity to work informally are the ones who suffer the most. And that includes young people, it includes women, it includes those in low skill occupations, it includes those in economic sectors that employ casual workers or where the activity involves very close interaction between people, and those with few years of education. That is, the most vulnerable ones are the ones who are likely suffering the most because of the crisis. Also, obviously, there is fear of COVID-19. We have social distance. This has also been a factor explaining employment losses, as we can see in the hospitality sector. And the impact is likely to continue at least until we can get rid of this pandemic, especially in these sectors that have to do with people interacting with social activities, because they are harder to carry out in an environment where you can catch the virus. This is all for employment. Now I'm going to move to where these people go. I mean, if they are not working, what are they doing, basically? I mean, probably you know that unemployment rates haven't changed much. This is what has been published officially by Turkestat. So where are they? Is the question. This is a snapshot of the situation for men and women in Turkey with COVID-19 and what would have happened without COVID-19. So let's look at it slowly. There are 7 statuses. A person can be employed, can be unemployed, discouraged. Let me remind you that someone who is a discouraged job seeker is someone who would like to start working, but who is not actively looking for a job. That's why we say discouraged. We have people who are performing household duties. We have people who are studying or in education. We have those who are retired. We have those who are chronic ill, or they are too old to work, in purple. And then we have an other category, people who are in none of these categories, which is not very big. If we start with women, we can see that the counterfactual, that is, Turkey without COVID-19, was predicting a 30% employment rate in May, at the peak of the pandemic. But with COVID-19, the employment rate was only 25.6%. That is, we lost women who were in employment. We already know that. Where did they go? Unemployment is almost the same, 4.6 to 4.4. In fact, unemployment decreased. The share of discouraged job seeker increased a lot, by 3 percentage points. So women went out of employment. They wanted to work, but they didn't actively look for a job, because obviously it wasn't the best of the times to look for a job. There was also a decrease in the number of women who were doing household duties, and there was an increase in the number of women who are in the other category and in the sick category. Now, let me tell you one thing. These categories, there is you can only choose one option. Okay, this comes from the labor force survey, and the labor force survey asks you why you are not looking for a job, and you can only choose one, the one you think is more relevant to your situation. That doesn't mean that someone who is, let's say, in education is not taking care of this household. It's just the main reason why you are not looking for a job. Okay. As for men, we have a similar story. There was a decrease in the share of people who are employed, and there was a huge increase in the share of discouraged job seekers. There was a small increase in the number of people who are sick, and there was a small increase in the other category. So basically, to summarize, we can see that those who were employed became discouraged job seekers. They want to work, but they weren't actively looking for a job because of the situation, because of the pandemic. Now, I would like to have a look at you at some of the time series of discouraged job seekers, people who are ill or too old to work, as well as people who are in the other category. This is the number of people this is the number of men who are discouraged job seekers, starting from 2017 in thousands. There used to be around 1 million discouraged job seekers in Turkey. It was pretty constant. Since the pandemic started, it went up to 2.2 million, and then it started to decrease with the ease of the lockdown measures. And you can also see the counterfactual that has been predicted by the econometric model for comparison purposes. There was a huge increase. Something similar happened for women. These are women who are discouraged job seekers. It used to be around 1.5 million, and it went up to 2.5 million, an extra million because of the pandemic. Now, the other category. The other category is interesting because, well, we don't really know what is it, but we can make some guesses because of what is not. The number of men in the other category has been slowly increasing from 400,000 to around 600,000. You can see the counterfactual as well. Because of the pandemic, it climbed up to 900,000. Something similar happened with women in the other category. It used to be very constant, around 1.5 million. It climbed up to 2.3 million in the pandemic at the peak. My interpretation, because we don't know, is that this is fear of COVID-19. That is, when they were asked why you are not working, or sorry, why you are not looking for a job, they said, well, there is a pandemic, I am scared. And this might be the reason why they were classified in the other category. That's just my interpretation that I want to share with you. And we can also see an increase in the number of males who are classified as ill, disabled, or too old to work. The number is relatively constant, around 1.3 million over the last 3 years. It climbed up to 1.6 million. Same happened with the number of females who are ill, disabled, or too old to work. It used to be around 2.6 million, very constant. It went up to 3.4 million, and it has remained there almost since April, May, even though it decreased slightly in July, August. There was an increase of 800,000 per month. So, conclusions. Where did workers go? Not to unemployment, we know that. It didn't change much. The unemployment rate didn't change much. More than 2 million people at the peak of the pandemic became discouraged job seekers. That is, they wanted to work, but they weren't looking for a job. That's where they went mostly. And there is also an increase in the other category, as well as in the category of people who are sick, disabled, or too old to work. I guess it's related to COVID-19, fear of COVID-19, lockdown measures, etc. Just to conclude, to finish this presentation, some concluding remarks. Employment losses affected mostly informal workers. They affect those in low-skilled occupations, sector with casual workers, women, young people, those with few years in education. Restrictions to dismiss employees minimize the impact of COVID-19 on formal employees. And the number of formal employers only started to grow in August after a pretty small recovery, which is a bit worrisome and is something that we will be keeping an eye on because of its importance in terms of job creation. It looks like a full recovery of jobs may not even happen in the short run. There might be some permanent damage done to the economy because of COVID-19, especially so in the hospitality sector. It might need the pandemic to be over for it to recover previous employment levels. And at last, in terms of risk and opportunities, there is a risk of losing the progress that this country has achieved in terms of bringing women back to work. It took Turkey 20 years to increase the employment rate from 26.2% to 32.2%. This is the female employment rate for women aged 15-64. Okay? In May, at the peak of the pandemic, it went down to 25.6%. We lost 20 years in 5 months. We are going to continue monitoring the recovery of employment for women, especially for young women. We are well aware that these women are particularly vulnerable not to come back to the labor market. That was the reason why the European Commission launched the Youth Guarantee. And the reason why they were guaranteeing jobs to young people is because they are well aware that the longer young people stay away from work, the higher the chances they will remain away from work, because their skills depreciate, because they lost contacts, etc. There shall be a continuation of measures to incentivize self-employed workers, especially employers, and to promote businesses. And it might be a good opportunity to favor economic sectors with higher formality rates in order to avoid recovering informal jobs, perhaps in inefficient sectors. That's all from my side. Thank you very much for being here. I am very grateful, and I give the floor back to Numan Bey. Thank you.
Evet, çok teşekkürler Luis. Gerçekten çok bilgilendirici, açıklayıcı bir sunum oldu. Ve şu sorumuzun cevabını aslında net bir şekilde aldık diye düşünüyorum. Salgın en çok kimi etkiledi? En çok kimi vurdu? Bunun cevabı netti. Öncelikli olarak kayıt dışı çalışanlar. Bu çok net bir şekilde gözüküyor. Bunun dışında kadınlar, gençler, genç kadınlar, işverenler en çok etkilenen gruplar olarak gözüküyor. Yine sektörel bazda restoranlar, oteller, diğer hizmetler sektöründeki kişiler, inşaat sektörü en çok etkilenenler arasında gözüküyor. Yine eğitim seviyesi düşük olanlar en çok etkilenenler arasında. Tabii şu soru da çok önemliydi. Çalışanlar nereye gitti? Eğer işsiz kategorisine gitmedilerse nereye gittiler? Bunun da cevabı ümidini kaybetmiş. Dolayısıyla işsiz olarak sayılmayan kişiler grubuna daha çok gittiği gözüküyor. Yine şu çok önemliydi. Bu yaptığın trend analiz, yani bu evrim nasıl evrimleşti? O evolution, nereye doğru gidiyoruz sorusunun cevabı çok önemli. Toparlanma adına aslında bize önemli ipuçları veriyordu. Zira Ağustos'tan sonra bir toparlanma olduğu net bir şekilde gözüküyor pek çok kategori için. Ama bu tabii salgının peakinin aşağıya düştüğü, salgınla mücadelenin ön plana çıktığı ve bunun da istihdam üzerindeki olumlu etkilerini görmüş olduk. Şu anda salgında yaşadığımız yeni peakle birlikte bunun da önümüzdeki birkaç ay içerisinde bu toparlanma sürecine sekte vurmasını ve tekrar orada yukarıya doğru giden grafiklerin belki aşağıya doğru düştüğünü göreceğiz gibi geliyor. Yine son olarak vurguladığım bir şey çok çarpıcıydı Luis. Kadın istihdamında 20 yılda elde edilen kazanımların geriye gittiğini, kadın istihdam oranının 20 yıl öncesine geri döndüğünü söylemen de aslında çok çarpıcı bir veriydi. Şimdi ben sorulara geçmek istiyorum. Soruları da aslında 3 kategoride ben gördüm. Birinci kategori sorular metodolojiyle alakalı, hesaplamalarla ilgili sorular. Diğer sorular aslında bu verilerin nasıl yorumlanabileceğiyle ilgili. Diğer bir kategori de öneriler. Bundan sonra aslında çalışılabilecek konularla alakalı. Şimdi İhsan hocamızın soruları var metodolojiyle ilgili. Özellikle İngilizce olarak yazmış. Ben de kolaylık olsun diye direkt İngilizce olarak okuyup özetlemeye çalışacağım. He suggests that disruptions during this period may have affected the data generation process in ways that differ from previous years. You know, we use household labor for survey results in this analysis, and he suggests that disruptions of data gathering might have affected the results. What do you think about this, Luis?
I couldn't hear the beginning of the question, Monday. I'm sorry, there was I was in another channel, then I was switched.
Okay. Luis, do you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you well now.
Okay, the question is about the data gathering. İhsan hocamız, he suggests that disruptions during this period of data generation might have affected the comparison with the previous years. What do you think about this?
I see. The question is fair, but we cannot really know whether this is the case or not. So we will assume that the figures are correct. There is not much we can do but to trust the work of Turkestat. In any case, I didn't see any particular strange movement in the data. The data seems pretty smooth and consistent with what we were expecting. And we don't have reasons, basically. I mean, it's a possibility, but we don't have reasons to suspect that there are important disruptions in the data generation after the pandemic. That's the answer I have.
Okay. Another follow-up from İhsan Bey is about, he suggests, can you please go over the list of RHS variables in your econometric model?
Yes, of course.
So what variables have you used in your econometric model?
Well, I can summarize. The variables we were using are inflation rate, consumer confidence index, retail confidence index, industry output, exports, overall exports of food products. We were using the number of construction permits, the confidence in the construction sector, the exchange rate between the Turkish lira and the US dollar. The reason is to have enough variables to cover different employment levels, employment time series, etc. What we did was modeling each of the time series we have presented. So we adjusted the interaction between these variables and the employment depending on which employment we were trying to estimate. For instance, if we try to estimate the construction sector, employment in the construction sector, I was putting more emphasis on variables related to the construction sector. These are the variables, and this is the approach that we follow.
Another question is about the age groups. Maybe I can read the question in Turkish, if you can switch to Turkish channel. Yaş gruplarına göre yapılan analizde çeşitlendirmeye gidilemez miydi? Örneğin çalışma çağı nüfusunun son 10 yılına tekabül eden 55-64 yaş grubuna durumu nasıl? Buna baktınız mı? Neden acaba yaş gruplarına göre bir çeşitlendirmeye gidilmedi? Teşekkür ederim.
I see. Basically, because we cannot do it. That's the answer, because we don't have the data. Unfortunately, the way Turkestat publish the data is for those who are age 15-24 and those age 25 plus. We don't have access to the original micro data, so we cannot do it. I mean, we would love to, and the question is right on target, but we cannot for now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question on methodology, then we can move into more content-wise, also interpretation questions. There is a question from, I suppose, Mr. Niall O'Higgins. If you can go to the question and answer and read the question yourself, because it's about a formula. The formula that you use to calculate the average impact in the reported figures. You see, you will see the formula, and maybe you can explain in wording, because the participants may not be able to see the question and the formula, but if you can explain the formula that you have used to generate and to calculate the average impact.
In short, the answer is yes. What Niall Higgins wrote is what I did. To explain the average impact, what I do, I add up the number of jobs between February to August without the pandemic. I take the difference between the number of jobs in the pandemic minus the number of jobs without the pandemic, and then I see what percentage of this difference is with respect to the counterfactual. So let's say there is a difference of 1 million jobs. Then I see, okay, 1 million with respect to what would have happened without pandemic, what percentage it is. So if there is 10 million employment without pandemic, and there is a difference of 1 million, then the impact is 10%. The average impact will be 10%. This is how it was calculated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question about the definition. What if a small business is temporarily closed because of COVID-19 and employees are not paid during this period? Are they considered as employed?
This is a question for Turkestat, more than for me. In principle, if the business is closed, temporarily closed, I'm not going to answer it. I am not sure for Turkestat.
Yes. No, maybe I can try to explain, to my knowledge at least. Bu soru şununla alakalı: bir işletme kapanmış, çalışanları da o dönemde ücretsiz izne gönderilmiş. Onlar çalışan istihdamda sayılıyor mu? Bildiğim kadarıyla sayılıyor. Çünkü TÜİK'in sorduğu soru işte geçmiş dönemde çalışıp çalışmamayla alakalı. Benim bildiğim kadarıyla onlar çalışan kategorisinde sayılıyor. Çünkü işsiz değiller. İşsizlik ödeneği veya ücretsiz izin ödeneği aldıkları için işsiz sayılmıyorlar diye biliyorum. Ama belki bunu netleştirecek olan bir katılımcımız varsa onun cevabını da okuyabiliriz. Yine another follow-up question about any relation between level of education and discouraged status. Have you worked on this? If there is any relation between level of education and discouraged status? Question from Melahat.
This kind of interrelations between variables is something that so far we cannot do because of the way data is published. I mean, Turkestat has published many time series, but the number of time series they publish is limited, obviously. And this kind of interrelations can only be worked on once you have access to the microdata. So the answer is no, we cannot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There is another question about where the workers go later on after the recovery. Where did the discouraged people go when the recovery began? Did they go to employment, education, or still they are further away from labor market? and maybe move to another category like sick, retired, or other?
It's not possible to know because basically we would need to follow individuals over time. We would need panel data. The labor force survey is not a panel. It doesn't follow the same people over time. Well, in practice it does for some people, but when the way we work with the data from the labor force survey, we cannot follow individuals. This is a question that we might work on in the future when we have access to the raw data. But again, this type of detailed questions is not possible to answer them with the current data. So we don't know. We don't know. That's the answer.
Okay. There is a question about women's employment. We see larger decreases in employment of women, especially young women. Is this because of increased childcare responsibilities due to school closures or due to employer preferences? So it's a kind of interpretation question. How do you interpret this? And apart from gender and age dimensions, it would be interesting to see the effect of women with children, in particular in this study. So again, this is this kind of relationship about, why was it that the women's employment decreased so much? Can
this is a very good. This one is very nice. This is a very nice point. I will write it down for later. Once again, I mean, in terms of data, we didn't study it. We cannot study it. We don't know. We don't know about the characteristics of these women, the ones who lost jobs. This is something that, in fact, I was planning to study further in the future, because there is something, I will tell something curious about this. In general, we can see that groups where there is higher informality are the groups where we see the bigger impacts of COVID-19. But for women, it's not the case. Young women, the share of young women who are employed formally is higher than the share of adult women who are employed formally. And yet, even though they work formally more often than adults, they lose jobs more often than adult women. And I don't know why, and this is something that I want to study once I can have access to more data. So yes, thank you for the comment, and we will look into it.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about the scope. Does this study include or involve only Turkish citizens, or foreigners are also included in this study or not?
The way Turkestat runs the labor force survey, it includes the non-institutional population. That it includes everyone who lives in Turkey, who lives legally in Turkey. It includes also foreigners who have residence permits, who have Turkish nationality, and so they are represented. However, they are a minority, and they are not likely to shape the results in any particular way. And the results that Turkestat publishes are aggregated. So yes, they are in there, but they are not shaping the results in any particular direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but have you any observation about their employment status, how they were affected? Have you looked at it before, maybe outside of this study?
We cannot look into it once again because we don't have access to the original data. We only have the data published by Turkestat, and they don't disaggregate by country of origin. We only have all together. But it's something we can do in the future. We will try to do in the future.
Okay. So there is an answer to our previous question. Workers on paid leave are not considered as unemployed. So this is in line with what I have been thinking. So the follow-up question is this: could you please comment on the number of workers on paid leave, which has specifically been regulated by the government during the pandemic? So have you made a study about those people who were sent to paid leave these administrative data published by the ministry. Have you looked at those also?
Yes, yes. What is the question exactly? Do you know how people on forced leave? Or
No,
those
could you
who...
please comment on the number of workers on paid leave? Let me maybe rephrase the question. How would the government's measures on, paid leave or short-term work might have affected the employment figures? Let me put it this way.
Well, I mean, these measures have saved many jobs, that's for sure. And surely they have helped many families. The measures have been extended over and over again during the last months. We will see what will happen once this is over. And we will see how it affected the number of hours work and earnings. And one of the problems with this support is that it pays much less than workers used to earn. That is, these households are seeing their income reduced. That might have also an impact. We will see. We will have a look at it. We will understand better in a few months what was the impact of this support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, there is a question on the construction sector. Can we consider construction sector as an inefficient sector, as mentioned in your last slide?
I mean, I wouldn't dare to say construction sector is inefficient. Depends on the country. I mean, once I had a look at the productivity of sectors in many countries in the world, and well, objectively, you could say that the construction sector is among the ones in terms of wages, but in terms of value added, it's relatively high. So it is a bit mixed views.
Okay. Another question is about the comparison of how Turkey is doing compared to OECD countries. Have you looked at the Turkey's stance vis-a-vis OECD countries? Or can we do this comparative study?
I mean, the thing is, there are countries like Spain that have also protected formal employment. And when you compare the numbers, you can see that they are very similar in terms of employment losses. I mean, I think in Spain, the average employment losses are around 6%. In Turkey, we were estimating them around 7%. Not very different. I mean, thanks to this measure to protect formal employment, I think Turkey is not faring very different to other countries, other OECD countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Have you also looked at the child labor? And do you think you can also consider child labor among the migrant populations?
In terms of the impact of the pandemic?
Yes.
Whether,
question. For example, it increased child labor. Can we look to this?
We will be able to, not for child labor, not from TWIC, we will be able to look at the employment rate of those age 14 years old. That's the furthest we will be able to go with the Turkestat data. For child labor, for children, for let's say age 6 to 13, Turkestat launched a child labor force survey last quarter of 2019. It's already published, but it doesn't continue. It will be tough. It will be a challenge.
But you can refer to our, ongoing separate work on child labor. We will be looking at child labor data. No.
Exactly. This is something that it needs to be. it needs to be ad hoc. It needs to be done. This is what the ILO office in Turkey is currently preparing, a study on child labor, preparing a survey in order to understand well, what is the prevalence and compare what is the impact of COVID-19 on the work arrangements of children. So this is something that we will hopefully carry out.
Mm. Okay, another question. I don't know if you will be able to answer, but maybe you can share if you have any view on this. How would have COVID-19 impacted the decisions of people to get retired? Do you have any observation?
I have a look at the number of people or the TDs. For women, there was no change. For men, there was a decrease, a slight decrease in the number of men who retired. It is probably due to COVID, but it's not for sure. In any case, there might have been an impact for men. If there was, it's small. That's what we can see from the data.
Mm-hmm. Also, another question on the methodology. You know, there is a retrospective question in household labor force surveys. The question is, what was your labor market status a year ago? So were you able to look at that? And because it might provide a rough test of robustness of your methodology, a suggestion by Mr. İnsan Tunalı.
Yes, this is the recall module of the labor force survey. Once again, we don't have access to the microdata. This study has been carried out with public data from Turkestat. Once we have access to the microdata, things like the one he suggested can be carried out and will be carried out, because this is a very interesting module. And we use it in some of our studies already.
Okay. Another question about your recommendations, for example, on increasing the skilled labor force, especially for female and youth employment, what can be done?
I mean, in terms of your recovery, Turkey was already on the way to recover, so I wouldn't recommend many things, but basically a stable economic environment, economic growth, support to small and medium enterprises, to entrepreneurs. Basically, that's what we need. I mean, we need employers to create jobs right now, because Turkey has lost almost 300,000 employers. I mean, how we want to generate jobs if we don't have people to create them? That's my main advice, my main concern, I would say.
Okay. So another question on methodology. You know, before 2014, Turkstat was looking at those who were looking for a job in the last 3 months. Now it's being reduced to last 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So there was a methodological change in Turkstat.
Yes.
How do you think that this would have affected, and how is it in other ILO member states? How is it in ILO's survey methodology, let's say? Would it be better with 4 weeks or 3 months?
Well, the change that Turkestat carried out in 2014 is to align the survey with the labor force surveys of are carried out by Eurostat in other European countries. Now, in terms of effect, it's small. We, in the ILO office for Turkey, harmonized the time series of unemployment rates. So basically, we built a hypothetical unemployment rate using the 3-month definition for the period 2014 to 2019. The difference is around 1 percentage point on average. So that there aren't big changes. There isn't a big impact. There wouldn't have a big impact if we were using the 3-month definition. That is not a big problem. It is a problem in terms of comparability, that which we have fixed for our own studies. But other than comparability in terms of actual figures, there isn't much to worry about, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis. I think we have gone through more or less all the questions and we are coming towards the end of our webinar. And I would like to go through now the suggestions, let's say. These are in a way homework for us to study and to go and look in depth in certain things. So I'm going to go through those suggestions. So one is that it might be useful to break down the on-account workers group by education or occupation to separate professionals from the rest. So keep in mind, I'm sure that some of these require access to microdata, which we don't have at the moment, but it's still good to note down this for our further research. Again, using the question on the number of workers in the workplace, it should be possible to measure the job losses associated with employees leaving employment. So again, this is something that we can look at it. Mm-hmm. And another question which I turned into a suggestion for further, this is to look at not only to Turkstat data, but also to look at the Social Security institutions' administrative records, because they provide information about the insured workers. So maybe next time we can also compare those, the evolving of, the insured workers and compare it with Turkstat data. So this is something we can do also next time. Again, there was a question on foreign workers, and there's a follow-up question, which I'm going to turn into suggestion, that we have to look at also the impact on the refugees or people under temporary protection. What was the impact on them? This is something that we are also working on, I can say. And lastly, maybe you have mentioned the situation in Spain. Maybe we can also do some more comparative analysis in certain sectors. There is a suggestion on to look at the hospitality sector, for example. So this comparative analysis we can also look into, maybe also not only as ILO office for Turkey, but ILO in general does this kind of also comparative studies. Evet, sevgili katılımcılarımız, çok teşekkür ederiz. Umarım sizler için faydalı bir sunum olmuştur. Bizim için çok yararlı ve zenginleştirici olduğunu ben şimdiden söyleyebilirim. Yine belirttiğimiz gibi sunumu sizlere paylaşacağız. E-mail adresi gönderen katılımcılarımız oldu. Yine eğer kayıt sırasında e-mail adresinizi verdiyseniz oralara da sunumu gönderiyor olacağız. Sizlerle paylaşıyor olacağız. Ben katılımınız için tekrardan çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bir başka etkinlikte buluşmak üzere. Hepinize iyi günler diliyorum.